The name of the poem is I Diminish Myself. If I define myself as my thumb, I deny myself my fingers. If I define myself as my fingers, I deny myself my hand. If I define myself as my hand, I deny myself my arm. If I define myself as my arm, I deny myself my body. If I define myself as my body, I deny myself my universe. I diminish myself. That was written by Dr. Huey P. Newton. And that directly contradicts the ideology and the philosophy of capitalism, which is, we learned yesterday, very individualistic and anti-nature, as it commodifies us to do labor and be under the total control of the capitalist system. That's it.
Thank you, Baba. So this is a session about, our session is called Thinking Dialectically. And the idea behind this session was that although this is a conference that obviously centers, it's a conference, an intensive, a course that centers the tradition known as social ecology and dialectical naturalism, which is a philosophy that undergirds social ecology. There's also, we recognize that there's also folks who are coming from all sorts of different traditions of thought and practice in the room. And so one of the things that we wanted to do, as Mason was suggesting, was think about ways that different approaches to thinking dialectically connect with one another, but also are different from one another in important ways. And in particular, we wanted to think about the relationships, connections between what's sometimes called dialectical materialism, and that's something that Wayne was going to speak to, partly because dialectical materialism was important really fundamental in the thinking of Dr. Huey P. Newton and the Black Panthers. But we also wanted to talk about dialectical humanism, which is a philosophy that was created, elaborated by James and Grace Lee Boggs here in Detroit. And then Chaia is also going to be speaking to dialectical naturalism, which Mason alluded to last night, which is philosophy elaborated, articulated by Murray Bookchin. So we wanted to start by just sharing a bit about how we all came to these three different traditions of thought and practice, and maybe just say a bit about how we understand dialectical thinking from the perspective of those three traditions. Does that sound about right, Chaia? Is that more or less where we're gonna start with?
That's great.
Okay. Well, Chaia, maybe we could start with you then, if that sounds okay. Chaia, how did you come to the philosophy of dialectical naturalism? What is it, and what has it meant to you in your life and in your practice?
Thank you so much. First, I want to just say how honored I am to be invited into this space. Thank you all for allowing me to Zoom in. I wish I could be there in physical presence, but I guess I'm physically there via fiber optics and sound technology and Zoom. But I also want to thank Mason for his incredible organizing efforts. And it takes a team of people, and I don't know who is all on the team, but I know that it takes a village to raise a course or a conference or an intensive. And I just want to really honor that. And I really want to thank the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center for coming together with the ISC to create this beautiful educational experience. And again, I'm so humbled and honored to get to be part of this. And yeah, so I ended up at the Institute of Social Ecology in 1984. I was still in college. I was a philosophy major. And I remember studying dialectics in college. And I remember, for me, the biggest takeaway from studying old white men who were philosophers that I studied undergrad was that I never knew where the teacher stood in relationship to the ideas, and I never knew the relationship between the ideas and anything happening in the real world struggle. I was very involved in the divestment movement related to South African apartheid. It was the 80s. And so when I ended up at the ISC in 1984, very accidentally, I ended up meeting this man who's Murray Bookchin, who was a self-taught autodidact. He was not in the academy, he has no formal education, didn't go to college. He worked in foundries, he was a labor organizer, and wrote Raised as a Marxist. And I see there's like a little library or bookstore that the ISC created in a closet in this building we were renting out. And I went into this closet and I saw these books by this man, Murray Bookchin, and they were political. And I saw, wow, here's a guy who's taking dialectical philosophy, the dialectical method used by Marx, dialectical materialism, and he's actually applying it as an anarchist, to really try to figure out how to save us as a human species from ecological collapse, and to change the world in terms of human misery by creating a revolutionary theory, movement, and hopefully a revolution that could create a better society that would allow society to play a positive and an elaborative role in natural history rather than a destructive one that is tyrannizing the majority of people on the planet. So that was my introduction to dialectical naturalism, was really meeting a politically engaged philosopher who was always an organizer and revolutionary at the same time they were together.
And Baba Wayne, how about same question for you? How did you come to dialectical philosophy? What was your path into learning about that? And I know that we're still, like, all of us are still learning today. But how were you introduced to dialectical thought, and what has it meant for you in your life and your practice? Because I know it's really been a central thing for you. Yeah.
Hello everybody again, and all power to the people again. I'll start off by saying that the definition of power, the dialectical definition of power that the Black Panther Party utilized, was the ability to first define phenomena and then make it act in a desired manner. This was very important to us as a cadre as we did our work in organizing the people, because we realized it's the people that make history and transformation. It's the people that identify the contradictions, and it's the people that utilize the philosophical and ideological creativity to deal with the reciprocal of capitalism. But it all started with me before the Black Panther Party and the National Committee to Combat Fascism. My kidnapping into the military from my neighborhood snatched me as an expendable worker, which I didn't know at the time. I just realized I didn't want to go because I didn't want to die fighting the war which was going on at that particular time in Vietnam. during the training, well, before the Army, we were already, my neighborhood, which some people define as the working class, and we talked about the definition of the city. I guess was yesterday. And to me, the definition of the city, I see nothing but a work camp in which labor is born. Labor, people are commodified to sell their labor, to produce a surplus and pay it a salary. And after that use of a whole community or of individuals, you're displaced, which what we're going through at this exact moment with AI or artificial intelligence or technology. AI technology is also a commodity that's replacing a human commodity. But when I left the community into the military and was finally sent to Vietnam, that's when my political education started, and I realized the similarities between the two communities or neighborhoods who were resisting the capitalist system at different levels of resistance, of course. And the racism that was in the military was extremely bad, just like in my neighborhood. In our working neighborhoods, it was extremely bad. Political oppression, economic oppression. There were race riots in Vietnam, which people didn't know about. People went to the other side, which people don't know about, to fight against the United States government. And actually, they're fighting against the United States government. But the constituency, I think, should be clear, is not the people, but the government's constituency is the corporate community and not us. While we were there, this was during the time when the churches were being bombed and the civil rights movement was happening. King was assassinated right after my kidnapping in the military. And the Vietnamese people asked me, why are you here? Doing the same thing to us as your military is doing to you. I didn't think of it in that way. I didn't think of myself as the police, but that's what I was. And that's when my orientation of capitalism first started. And that's important as far as understanding dialects, to have a clear analogy of external conditions of the objective world and what's really happening as an anthropological cultural transformationist. That's my term for revolutionary. you have to have a good understanding, a good study, and that method of analyzation is dialectical materialism. That's what all power to the people means, the correct definition of phenomena to make it act in a desired manner. That's what we did in the Black Panther Party. When I got home after learning from the people's resistance in Vietnam from the Vietnamese people, which is my community also and still is, I hated white people. I understood from my analysis that white people was the primary contradiction. After I tried to organize an army, which I was very unsuccessful because I didn't know how to organize, I joined the National Committee to Combat Fascism because I thought that was my answer to get rid of white people. And I found out very different that that's not what the Black Panther Party was all about. And it was not about that because of the methodology of thinking, which was dialects and study. It was also a study of dialects that stemmed also from practice, from the theory of your analyzation of what was going on around you, particularly with the beneficiaries and protectors of capitalism. What were their techniques? What were their tactics and strategy? And I'm speaking in military terms because that's what it is. So what are these tactics and strategies? We found one of the best ways to analyze these factors was we drew fire from the system because we were feeding children a free breakfast every morning. That may sound crazy, but under capitalism, the commodity is expendable and marginal. When people control their destiny and they're able to stay alive, that is a direct contradiction to capitalism, especially when we erase all of the cultural lines of demarcation, religion, racism, patriarchy, misogyny. There's a whole bunch of them: light skin, dark skin, curly hair. When we erase all of those capitalist-made misconceptions of who we are and relationships to each other, they have to respond to that. And when they respond, that's much better than getting the disinformation from the educational system or a number of books that define capitalism for what is not. You get a chance to really see who these so-called people are. That's dialects. Dialects is also the practice or devising the tactics in practice of how we respond to that, to free ourselves, to withdraw, while in fact we are creating a true system of sustainability. Because remember, they do not want us to stay alive. In order to fight capitalism, global capitalism, racial, class, anthropocentric global capitalism, you have to be alive. You have to be able to exist. You have to be able to breathe. You have to be able to think. You have to be able to have the conversations. All that entails survival, pending, as we used to say, survival pending the complete dismantling, the complete qualitative dismantling of the global capitalist system. That's going to take time to devise the tactics. That's going to take time to get through all the disinformation, all the incorrect ideas, all the incorrect practices. And what I mean by incorrect, I mean practices that don't coincide with reality, with the reality of dismantling the capitalist system. I think we used to say truth is the criteria to practice. Practice is criteria. Yeah, okay. Practice is the criteria to truth. And if you're not alive, you can't go through that process of cultural transformation. Because revolution is not a conclusion. It's a very long, arduous process of mistakes, learning, building, education, and more practice. Because while we're doing all this, the corporate community is going to also change its tactics. And we have to be on top of it. We have to understand the transformation of nation-state capitalism to, for instance, global capitalism. We have to understand that process. How is global capitalism, in order to stay alive, how does that affect the structure of the city? It's changed. It's not the same as it was in the 60s. So we have to understand the process of development and the laws that create that transformation of all things and all matter. Okay, I've said enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Baba. And I'll try to be brief with my story. I should preface things by saying that I'm by no means an expert on dialectical thinking. I'm very much a student of Baba's, a student of other comrades at the Boggs Center. But I will say a bit about how I came to it, because I have a story that's not dissimilar from Chaia's, I suppose. I was also formally trained as a philosopher in Canada. And I mostly studied with feminist philosophers in Canada, and specifically folks who were thinking about relational theory and thinking about relational ethics. And I moved to Detroit from Canada in 2012, and one of the first books I read when I moved here was this little blue one. I don't know if folks have seen this before, but it's going back to what Stephen was saying yesterday, that year, 1963, is a really significant one in the city, for among other reasons, because it was the year when this book was published. This is The American Revolution, Pages from a Negro Worker's Notebook by James Boggs. And as someone who was formerly trained in philosophy, I, like Chaia, was stunned by this autodidact, auto worker who had the audacity, had the chutzpah to basically try to do what, for his time, what Marx had done for his. And what impressed me most about James Boggs was, here's a guy he worked 37 years in the Chrysler plant, was engaged in union organizing, organizing with and against his union in various ways. But he had the audacity in 1962 to, this book, by the way, before it was published by Monthly Review as a book, it was an internal document in an organization that James Boggs was a part of called Correspondence. And the internal document, when he wrote it, led to a really dramatic split in the organization when C.L.R. James, some folks may have heard of C.L.R. James, decided to split with the organization because what James Boggs had said was so controversial, so audacious. And he suggested that, all that we could take from Marx, this is sometimes how he put it, all we could take from Marx in the early 60s was his method of analysis, which is dialectical thinking. But that conditions on the ground had changed so dramatically since the time that Marx was writing, right? Working in an auto factory in early 1960s Detroit is a lot different than working in a textile mill in like 1845 London, okay? And one of the things that James noticed was that, quite unlike the scenario that Marx depicted for revolution, which is where you would have increasingly more people being proletarianized, more people working in plants, factories, other things, becoming organized on the shop floor and eventually creating a party that would overthrow capitalism, etc. What Boggs was noticing was that in in the 50s and early 1960s Detroit, the working class was shrinking. And it was not only shrinking in numbers, but it was becoming less militant. And one of the factors, among others, that was creating this situation was the introduction of automation and cybernation into the plants. So more and more people were getting replaced, basically, on the shop floor by machines that were doing their work. And of course, who were the first people to lose their jobs when this was happening? Well, the people who traditionally have been doing the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs in the plants, right? Which were mostly young black men. And so Boggs noticed this, and he saw that, quite unlike what Marx was projecting, he was living through a situation where the working class was shrinking and becoming less militant. And at the same time, you had all kinds of people who were being rendered not just temporarily unemployed, but, as he put it, permanently unemployed, structurally unemployed, right? Living in neighborhoods where there were no longer any decent prospects for living a middle-class lifestyle, working in the plant, that kind of thing. And there was a growing class of what he called, what Marx probably would have called the lumpen proletariat or something like that. But Boggs introduced a new term, which was the outsiders. He said there's a new class of people that are growing in cities like Detroit, people who are not just temporarily, but like permanently excluded from mainstream economy and society. And if that's the case, how could it be that a revolution in the context of the United States, an advanced capitalist country with increasingly automated factories, how could it be that a revolution in the United States would be carried out by an industrial working class, right? So he began to realize that we couldn't just sort of take Marxist philosophy and ideology for granted as like a guide to how to make revolution in your own country at any given time Instead, what you need to do is do, as I was saying, what Marx did for his time, for your own time. And the only way to do that is to learn how to genuinely think for yourself. And not think for yourself like on your own in your bedroom or something like that, but think for yourself when you're engaged in practice trying to change the existing system, trying to transform the existing system. And I'll try to wrap things up. But I'll leave you with this provocation. In the early 1960s, Boggses suggested that we had left what he called the era of dialectical materialism and entered, with the Black freedom movement especially, a new phase in the struggle in the United States, which he called the era of dialectical humanism. And this was an era where, as I was suggesting, we could no longer rely on the industrial working class to carry out a revolution in an advanced capitalist country like the United States. And it was also a period in which we needed to not only rethink who would be carrying out revolution in this context, but what the goals of revolution had become in this very new situation, and what sort of things revolution would need to involve. And what Boggses really put his finger on was that the problem that revolutionaries have not yet dealt with in the US context is what to do with the growing millions and millions of people who are being pushed out of mainstream economy and society completely, being rendered outsiders. We can't just be organizing workers, only workers, and we also can't just easily think about, creating coalitions among the employed and the unemployed, because there are really serious antagonisms, a growing antagonism, he thought, between these groups. So the question that he raised in the early 1960s was, well, through thinking for himself, through applying Marx's dialectical method in a very new context, was what are we going to do about the growing numbers of the outsiders? But not just that, who do we need to turn to for the most kind of radical analysis of the situation we're living through now? And so he thought that we needed to turn to folks he called the outsiders for that analysis. Anyway, I'll stop there. Chaia, can I ask you a question?
Sure. Me?
Yeah. Why is dialectical thinking, whether we're talking about a dialectical materialist approach or a humanist or naturalist approach, why is that something that is important for revolutionists today? Like, what are we missing out on if we aren't striving to do what Murray Bookchin did and what James Boggses did, both autodidacts, non-traditional intellectuals, organic intellectuals? What would we be missing out on if we didn't follow their lead?
I call that the big so what question.
Thank you.
So what the fuck question. And I think it's a really fair question that everybody should ask when they're studying the role of ideas that were generated sort of within the center of power. Dialectical tradition is part of Western philosophy. And many might say, this is, can you dismantle the master's house using the master's tools? And what's fascinated me about kind of, as I've sort of deepened my relationship to political philosophy, is to see how people at the margins of the center, someone like Bookchin, who, his parents were very poor Jews who were very persecuted in Russia, where Jews were kidnapped into the army, Jewish men, and decimated. And that's why my grandparents all came here, was to escape being kidnapped into an army and killed. And Bookchin was very lucky. He ended up in the Bronx and was raised a communist, and really believed that the revolution was going to happen, and that it wasn't if, it was when it was, or if it was when. And he believed that, socialism, as he understood it, stateless socialism, was inevitable, determined by noble historical scientific laws. But then he saw, the rise of Stalin, and a lot of Marxists who came of age watching the rise of Stalin absolutely were shook and had to really rethink kind of what was it in dialectical materialism that could allow for this kind of authoritarian bloodbath, an authoritarian state, really. So if I may, because I'm a philosophy nerd, if you guys will put up with me, I might do just a little kind of ABCs of dialectics, because a lot of people are not familiar even with what that word means. I know most people I know are not. So if it's okay, I'm going to just do like a little kind of what is dialectics and why does it matter? I think that's what the main question is. So what? And this is something that I do when I teach on Zoom or talk on Zoom. It helps me to organize my thoughts visually, and sometimes it's helpful to other people. So for folks who are not familiar with dialectics or the dialectical tradition, dialectics is a methodology for thinking about two or more set of contrasting ideas or categories. And you could trace the history back to Aristotle, but it really got kicked up again in the modern period by a philosopher named Friedrich Hegel, who was Marx's teacher. And dialectics is, again, it's a methodological tool. One of the branches of philosophy that dialectics fits into is called epistemology. Episteme in Greek means to know, and epistemology simply means thinking about thinking and thinking about good ways to know and productive ways to know that help us do our work. In this case, hopefully, as revolutionaries. So dialectics is a really important way to look at the relationship between two or more contrasting categories. And there's kind of three kinds of relationships that can be studied dialectically. One is looking at the contradictory relationship between two categories, like the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie controls the means of production, and proletariat work the means of production and get barely nothing. They get slave wages. The second kind of relationship between two categories is complementary, where there are two things that could be considered complementary, and that would not be true with Marx's dialectic. There is nothing complementary between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It's a one-way, top-down relationship of exploitation and ruination. So that would not be true for Marxian dialectic. And the third is the developmental kind of dialectic, where there's something, as there's a change, as one category moves into another, where development happens. And just to really briefly look at Hegel's dialectic, he was interested in a master-slave dialectic. He was interested in power. And he was interested in how slaves, through their work, develop a consciousness of self and a sense of self that has more power than what the master has. And so paradoxically, the slave is more masterful than the slave. And then Marx takes that and he takes Hegel's dialectic and changes it. The master is the bourgeoisie, as I mentioned, the slave is the proletariat. And for Marx, it was inevitable. It was by determined, noble, natural, historical law that the worker would overthrow capitalism. And people like Boggses and many Marxists who watched that not happen, who watched the labor movement get kind of absorbed and assimilated into a consumer society, as unions became kind of co-opted by a lot of different forces, where you actually have the workers who are sometimes fighting to preserve the capitalist system. So Boggses, like many Marxists, came to see the his dialectical materialism, this idea of the people who are working the material of production, watching that they were not overthrowing capitalism with bourgeoisie. And so Boggses thought, it's really important to deal with, if we want a revolutionary philosophy, we need a successor theory that can bring us further than what Marx was able to do. So Boggses looks at a different dialectical pairing. And instead of looking at capitalism, Bookchin looks at society in general and looks at the problem of hierarchy in general. And that's why Bookchin chose anarchism rather than communism or socialism as a body of thought to develop in. He felt that the analysis on capitalism and work was too narrow, and it missed categories like patriarchy, like white supremacy, like colonialism, and all forms of social domination that were not being centered within Marxism. And Bookchin looked at the contradiction between society and nature, and that's why Bookchin dedicated most of his life, political life, to trying to really highlight the stakes of what will happen if society, revolutionaries in society don't figure out how to change this dualism where society is destroying nature, where we know it's 1% of society that's immiserating humanity and destroying the world. And last week, we had 3 days consecutively, I think it was Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, that were recorded as the hottest days recorded in global history, that there was data taken from around the globe. So we're and I don't have to tell you, you're all here because you understand we're in a serious ecological crisis that's also a humanitarian crisis, because ecological crisis hits Black and brown people first, hardest, etc. And I'm coming to an end here. So Bookchin, had to figure out how do I figure out how to take this, this dialectical, I'm trying to find my little thing here. What do I do with that nature society dualism where society's dominating over nature? What do I do with that? And how do I create a different or understand a different relationship? And at the beginning, I said, when you have two more categories and you're looking at them dialectically, in this case, nature and society, what Bookchin did was he got rid of the concept of nature as a separable entity to society and said that nature is basically the history of natural history. It's the beginning of the first organic cells of life that unfold in a non-deterministic way with no hard end of history or telos, such as the one that was proposed by Marx. And that society moves to a first nature, which is the emergence of all human life before humans emerge. And then we hit a second nature, which is very problematic because our species and 1% of the species has the power to create and the power to destroy. And we are living out, sadly, the legacy of the latter ability that humans have, which is to destroy. And so Bookchin believed, like Marx, there could be a utopian society, but it would be, and Bookchin called it third nature, society where people are free to govern themselves in global or municipal assemblies in their cities, towns, and villages, confederated with other free cities, towns, and villages. And so Bookchin's dialectical naturalism takes a view of a natural history as a kind of developmental process where humans can become increasingly conscious and self-conscious and even conscious as revolutionaries as to how to address social hierarchies of all kinds, and now we call that intersectionality, and how to address the ecological crisis. So Bookchin's dialectical naturalism is epistemological because he's looking at another way to think. There's also, he tries to form an ethics. He gleans from this movement in ethics some ideals of solidarity, mutualism, non-hierarchy, direct democracy, municipal democratized economics, as and anti-racism and anti-patriarchy, etc., as a way to move us developmentally forward. And he gets rid of the dualism, and I think it's one of the most, important Marxists who figured out, how do I come to terms with this legacy of dialectical materialism, and how do I, as Bookchin called it, ecologize the dialectic? How do I give it a naturalistic history? And how do I take off some of the parts of Marxist theory that were deterministic, that believe there are laws of history, that Bookchin felt were connected to why Marxism was able to go down, become Stalinism effectively. and why the Soviet Union became this authoritarian regime. And it's why Bookchin believed that there are no laws of history, there are sets of potentialities that humans can choose to embody and practice. And so for me, that's the stakes. We have to have a radical, coherent way of thinking through how we got to where we are and how to go forward to create an ecological, anti-racist, and whole society.
Thank you, Chaia. Baba, how about same question for you? So Chaia's laid out some of the ABCs of dialectics. How would you explain to someone who's not familiar with dialectics why it's important to you in your life and for revolutionists generally? Like, why do we need dialectical thinking in order to orient ourselves now and figure out what needs to be done now and what our practice should be like, what programs we should be developing?
Dialects in think. Yeah, good question. You can't have the thinking without the practice, and you can't have the practice without the thinking. And the analyzation. Those three go together. And all three of those aspects of dialects are always in a constant state of transformation. There's no stagnation at all, which changes your analyzation, changes your thinking, and absolutely changes your practice, particularly as a cultural transformationist. You cannot be stagnant and expect to keep up with the dialects of change within the capitalist system. It's war. It's a battle. It's a fight. You're in the ring. It's a duel. In that fight, both opposing forces study each other, and the same move is never made twice without the other opponent understanding, and that's transformation. And I think there's a series of these small quantitative developments that eventually create or will create the total qualitative transformation of a particular thing. And the thing that we're talking about is right now is capitalism, which makes room for new contradictions, new problems that we can't see now because capitalism is in the way. For instance, when capitalism is gone, how do we utilize technology? How do we de-commodify technology so that it's not destructive, so that we can control it and our own destinies? To me, the dialects of thinking, practice, and analyzation are essential, but understanding the laws of development and transformation, just like in Huey's poem, you can't define yourself absolutely as one particular thing without denying something else. And that's what the capitalist structure wants us to do. They don't even do that. They know that they have to constantly change. This hierarchical system has been in a state of transformation for thousands of centuries, or hundreds of centuries, at least a long time, to what it is become today. And I think that dialectical approach is extremely important to understand where this hierarchical system came from to best define what it is today. I just found out recently about the burghers during the time of the monarchy. Both of them hierarchical systems, transitioning one out until we have what we have today. I don't know if I answered your question. Thank you.
So just to add to what the two of y'all were saying, hi, I'm glad you brought up the way that Bookchin. Well, it seems like Bookchin, as someone who was raised as a Marxist, despite the atrocities of Stalinist, right, the Stalinist USSR, didn't give up completely on the dialectical method. Maybe there were certain of Marx's ideas that he wanted to dispense with or thought were mistaken. Like, as you put it, the idea that this process of dialectical development of reality has some kind of telos or endpoint, something that it's sort of driving towards, and that movement towards that endpoint was something that was inevitable, right? And so on that sort of picture, the role of revolutionaries is just to raise people's consciousness to that sort of, I'm oversimplifying, but to raise people's consciousness to that inevitable unfolding of the dialectic so that they could become an active part of that unfolding. But I was talking about this with Baba the other day too. It seems like the Panthers also rejected this idea that the overthrow of capitalism was something that was inevitable, or that there was some endpoint to dialectical development where all of the contradictions would finally be resolved, right? And there would be a sort of final solution to all of the struggles in human society. Because that's an idea, some people sometimes encapsulate that idea by saying that Marx or Marxists held on to an idea of a closed dialectic, a dialectic that comes to some kind of conclusion, right? For Marx, it was a classless society, a society in which there's no longer this antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But one of the connections that I'm seeing between dialectical naturalism, the Panthers' version of dialectical materialism, and the Boggses' dialectical humanism is this idea, this commitment to the idea of an open dialectic, which suggests that there is no promised land, there's no final answer, there's no place where we finally get away from contradictions in our society, antagonistic relationships between people, classes of people, groups of people, but that every time that we succeed in resolving a given set of contradictions, there are bound to be new ones that emerge. So we're instead presented with this picture of a process of potentially infinite development, and that contradiction and tension is an ineradicable feature of life, not something that is, that is finally going to be resolved and will finally live in that, the palace, the promised land, the utopia. And it seems like these are two very different ways of orienting towards revolutionary practice, depending on whether you adhere to this idea of the inevitable overthrow of capitalism, or you see contradiction as something ineradicable, inevitable, something that's always going to continue evolving, developing into. So I wonder, given that this is a connection across these three traditions we're talking about, I wonder if either of you wanted to share anything about just the significance of that idea, right? If there's right, and Baba, we'll start with you. But like, if there's never, if there's no end point, how does that change the way we orient towards revolutionary practice, right? Because it seems like obviously that means that like our work is never going to be done, for one, if there is a sort of infinite progression here. But I wonder if we could draw out some other strands as well.
This transformation is not just going to happen.
You can't just sit around and wait for it.
Right. You can't sit around and wait on it. It all depends on how we're able to analyze and maintain our existence as a transformative revolutionary force to sustain ourselves in the midst of the American empire. How do we sustain ourselves as revolutionaries with revolutionary values and principles now? How do we create the situation where these principles of sustainability, these values of what we're talking about today as dialectical humanism, how do we protect that while we are withdrawing from capitalism, while capitalism is resisting our sustainability? Capitalism has to expand. And a while ago, I was worried that capitalism, because of technology, has been able to expand into the cosmos. I was listening to a conversation on public radio, and they're already talking about how to conduct themselves from planets thousands of miles away. Do we have to really have a constitution? Do we really have to share anything? Can we just come back to Earth and steal the water legally? So capitalism is already expanded, which is creating new problems for us here on Earth. We still have to maintain and figure out how to sustain a humane culture. I was reading this book, You Best Build the Road by Walking It. I forgot the author's name. We can't wait to resolve the contradictions of misogyny and patriarchy, individualism, capitalism. We can't wait. The best way to resolve these contradictions is to create the situation between ourselves and work these things out. That's what happened in the Black Panther Party. I remember someone asking Elaine Brown, who was president of the Black Panther Party while Huey was in Cuba, about the misogyny. She kind of got upset and said something to the effect, the brothers did not come from revolutionary heaven. These contradictions had to be worked out while we were organizing. That's the best way. I remember the contradictions between the brothers and the sisters. And we had this saying, no PP without PE. Y'all know what I'm talking about? No pussy without political education. We lived as a collective, and I remember going by the rooms. All the brothers were reading the Red Book, studying dialectical materialism, reading the paper. And that was necessary because those contradictions of misogyny and patriarchy work very well in the capitalist society, extremely well. They do not work in a real, humane, sustainable situation. But how do we protect that? How do we protect it from the counterintelligence program? How do we protect it from your internal contradictions that you hold within yourself? So there's structure, there's study, and there's practice still. Okay, that's enough. Thank you.
Chaia, any thoughts that you'd like to share on this question, or other thoughts as well? But I'm curious, how does this idea of an open dialectic change the way we orient towards revolutionary practice? Or how does it do it in the context of dialectical naturalism and social ecology?
The shift for Boggses when he kind of realized he kind of outgrown the Marxist kind of capsule, was he had like three main insights. One, he realized that Marx's dialectic was deterministic, and you both have touched on that, this idea of a knowable end, or the Greeks called it telos. But that, like how you said that, Mike, that there's this kind of infinite development where new contradictions will keep arising. And it's true, and something that Boggses would say is that as we move closer, if we're lucky enough to have a revolutionary movement really happen, as we move closer and closer to our ideal society, it should recede further and further away in the future. It should. I'm so sorry. Somebody should not have a telephone. Sorry about that. That the utopia should never be static or reachable. It's something that's open-ended. And that's a huge shift for Marx, because Marx was really, he came out of a tradition of where human history was looked at from a cultural evolutionary perspective. Marx believed there were, determinable phases that every society would go through. The contradiction was always between who controls the means of production and who works the means of production. And so Marx believed it started with primitive communism. That might be what indigenous people did, what human history did for 99% of our human history. We were hunter-gatherers. It's really recent that we went to agriculture and now to post-agriculture, post-industrial agriculture. But he believed that you have primitive society, and then you have something called barbarism. Nobody really knows what that was. Then you have feudalism, that are agricultural monarchies, and then you have capitalism. And Marx believed that capitalism, though creating misery, was a necessary stage that every society had to go through. And again, this is Eurocentrism at its worst, in my mind. This idea that every society on the planet had to become proletarianized. And China, Mao's little red book that you refer to, Wayne, that Mao, the whole proletarianization of the whole nation of China, that happened very rapidly. There's no other huge agrarian society that proletarianized so quickly. They did that because they believed they had to go through these necessary stages, have industrial become industrialized, become proletarianized, so that you could then have a dictatorship of the proletariat. That way of seeing the world as being determined by knowable, necessary laws leads to authoritarian ways of organizing, authoritarian ways of living within our revolutionary organizations. And it's why Marxist organizations never were really able to, and I would say still, I don't think there's any revolutionary organization that's really been able to transcend racism when it's folks of different ethnic, racialized backgrounds get together, and why we've not been able to transcend patriarchy when it's men and women and gender variant people working together. It's because these contradictions are just still so part of our everyday lives. They're so hegemonic or taken for granted, we can't even think about them. And so for Bookchin, it was important to say there is no knowable end of history. There is no determined necessary law that's going to get us there. All we have is ourselves and our sets of principles that hold us together, and our commitment to retain those principles that we ground our vision on to build a new society. And that has to be my top 5 is one, we're non-hierarchical, and every organization has to say, if there's sexism going on in your organization, you're contradicting your values. If there's white supremacy and racism going on in your movement, you're contradicting your values if you say that you are non-hierarchical. The idea of having a direct democracy, that again retains the more general idea of non-hierarchy. And it's so important because if we don't have explicit principles of non-hierarchy that explicitly say we embrace a radical humanism that believes that every human being shares the same pool of human potential, then we will be working on, at the forefront of our minds, mindfully working on sexism, racism, colonial ideologies that are so entrenched in how we think and do. So that is why I think Marx, he couldn't, or that model that was deterministic and lawful, literally blinded people to seeing that there are no guaranteed ends, and that we have to choose over and over and over and over. We have to choose freedom and choose a radical humanism over and over and over and over. And I also just want to say that, where Bookchin swapped out Marx's notion of natural law for the idea of natural potential, for looking at the potentialities within the animal world. If you look at Peter Kropotkin's book, Mutual Aid, that there's this really long legacy of anarchists looking at the natural world, the animal world, and seeing they actually are not organized hierarchically. They are organized, there's symbiosis, and there is interdependence, and there's mutualism far more than there is competition. But humans who are living in a capitalist system, and Marx is one of those, believe that those trends were written in our DNA, written in the laws of social and natural history. And by replacing this idea of natural law for natural potential and human potential, Bookchin really opened, I think, the doors for people to really insist on, at every moment in the revolutionary process, we prefigure the good world we want to create. We prefigure all the forms of freedom, and we institutionalize them through practices in our organizations and within the good society. And I'll just say that, in Rojava, I don't know if anybody has referred to it yet, because I wasn't there yesterday, but in Rojava, folks are really taking a lot of these ideas that Bookchin developed and are putting them into practice. These are Syrian Kurds and Kurds from different parts of Kurdistan who have basically occupied northern Syria and are creating a political project, experiment in democratic confederalism. They are living in confederated cities, towns, and villages, and they are at the forefront of their movement is respecting cultural, ethnic differences and transcending patriarchy every single day. And they're doing something new. I mean, they're really, I think, taking this idea of a post-Marxist, drawing from Marx, but transcending Marx's limitations and creating this open-ended understanding of how we move forward with principles, but open-endedness.
Thank you, Chaia. Let's open things up to questions from folks.
Thank you all. So, 2 questions, both of which in part look back a little bit to some things that were said yesterday and also look ahead a bit to what's going to be said in the next session and in the coming days. So the first question is for Chaia and Mike. Second question is for Wayne. Chaia and Mike, dialectical naturalism and dialectical humanism, both in some way, as you just were just speaking to, Chaia, attempt to transcend dialectical materialism. So I want to ask a question and invite you to think about putting those into direct conversation, dialectical naturalism and dialectical humanism, and particularly around the question of values, which Roberto raised yesterday, and again, he'll be speaking to us about shortly. In terms of thinking about how we deal with the ecological crisis. So yesterday, Mason gave the example of a 1%er man and a woman in another part of the world who have one former has the power to, and the negative power to impact the environment. The latter does not. But I'm thinking about those of us in the middle, so to speak. It's not exactly in the middle, further on the one end of the spectrum. But anyway, particularly in the U.S. and perhaps the West more broadly, whose our own materialism is also an important part of the contributing factor to and needs to be transformed to stop global warming, to deal with the ecological crisis. So that's a particular way to think about how the two systems of thinking can be brought into conversation with each other. Mm-hmm. Particularly what might dialectical humanism say, which does think about values, to or with dialectical naturalism. Mm-hmm. Okay, Barbara Wayne, your question for you. What, from what you share with us today, informs or is expressed in your work, either as a revolutionary artist or with freedom growers? Again, this is looking ahead because some people will be visiting, perhaps everyone will be visiting Freedom. So what can you say about your work in either or both of those spaces? Even just a hint for what people can be looking forward to as they visit that space.
Do you want to start?
No. As I was talking earlier about how things progress, me being a member of the Boggses Center, and a former member of the Black Panther Party, both are very heavy on the way that I think. And it's a constant struggle not to become embraced in dogma, resisting stagnation, acquiring abilities to listen to the contemporary members of this society who are engaged in a new relationship, a new antagonistic relationship with capitalism, which was quite different from mine. And how do I contribute to my new understandings of these things to our contemporary movement against what I term global, not global, global capitalism and the American empire. That's reflected in my artwork also. And what's happened at Freedom is that Myrtle told me a long time ago, you do not know how to organize. And Freedom has a very feminine side, revolutionary feminine side. And I'm learning to recognize the strengths of that. Like Elaine Brown wrote this book, the Black Panther Party, I think, A Taste of Power, from a black woman's perspective. And that's important. That's something that the capitalists have been trying to, or the hierarchy, the development of the political and economic hierarchical systems since centuries and centuries ago have been trying to find a justification, the legalization, to stamp out a woman's perspective of things. And that goes for indigenous two-spirited people, the gay community. These are different perspectives that we need to listen to. And I try to reflect that in my artwork. And it's funny, I flunked all the way through school. I used to skip kindergarten. I'm serious. I used to skip kindergarten, and my parents had to walk me to kindergarten to make sure that I went there. And that's why I got drafted into Vietnam, because I got a scholarship, not a scholarship, but I was accepted at Ferris State, a college here, to study what they called then commercial art. But when I was younger, I would write an essay, and the words that I couldn't spell, I would draw a picture. So that didn't go very well with my English teacher, and I ended up flunking all the way through English in school. I mean, all the way through. So art became very important for me as a way to express not just art for art's sake. Like one of my other stories is Michelangelo working for the art director, the Pope. His job was to create divinity for the people to worship the Pope. My method of art is for the people to recognize themselves as human beings in the midst of a very brutal, antagonistic situation with capitalism. And that's how I express my artwork. Okay, thank you.
Hi, y'all. My name is Rosewater. Thank you so much for putting on this event and sharing your experiences and your knowledge. I guess the sort of question that I have is, what scales do you feel dialectical analysis is useful for? Because when I have a decent understanding of dialectics, I've never particularly been drawn to it even if I found it useful, because it has always seemed so very large and abstract. And like, yeah, I guess when it's like, when it comes to like trying to build the ability to do dialectical thinking, I'm like, well, what does that look like? What is the step-by-step of looking at a situation and applying that analysis? Is it useful for an individual workplace? Is it useful for a neighborhood? Or is it primarily a tool where we're looking at the whole of society? And I guess if it is something that you think can be applied to a more sort of comprehensible scale, could you all if it's something that you can easily bring forward right now, could you all do an example of what would a step-by-step of that, you have this situation, this is how you begin the analysis, this is how I might, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, Chaia and Wayne, I just wanted to try and respond a little bit to Rosewater and to Stephen's question as well, because I think my answer might bring the two of them together a bit. But Rosewater, thank you for that question. I think that is an excellent question. That is an excellent question. I think the first thing I want to say is that at least the tradition of dialectical thought that I'm most familiar with would encourage us to think about different scales as in relationship to one another. So that even if you are primarily interested in, say, the scale of a city or a neighborhood or even this room, that we need to be thinking about the ways that the contradictions that are playing out, say, in this space here, are related to contradictions that are playing out on a global scale, at the scale of a particular society or country, say, and so forth. So the short answer, I think, is yes, right? Dialectical thinking is useful at different levels of analysis, if we want to think that way, right? Or different scales. But it's most useful when those scales are put into relationship with one another. So and let me give you a concrete example that I think might speak to Steve's question a bit. So the Boggses, for example, I spoke about how James Boggs thought that all that we could take forward from Marx was his method of dialectical analysis, but that in the context of post-war United States, right, that the kind of conclusions that analysis would yield are going to be vastly different than the kind of conclusions that they yielded in the 19th century for Marx and Engels and so forth. When it comes to your question about methods, the Boggses make an important distinction between revolutionary philosophy, revolutionary ideology, and revolutionary programs. The revolutionary philosophy is dialectics. That's where dialectical thinking comes in. And as Chaia was saying, they think of it as a method of thinking that's based on certain principles that have to do with the way that we conceive of reality or nature or whatever you want to call it. On the basis of that method, the way that you would go about your analysis at any given scale is to analyze or to figure out what are all the different contradictions that are in play on that scale and try to identify the main or the principal contradiction, the resolution of which would help to advance society qualitatively to a different place. So Chaia mentioned that for Marx, right, the primary contradiction globally, as well as in 19th century England, is the contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The Boggses argued that in the context of the post-war United States, that the primary contradiction, right? So thinking about a particular scale of analysis, thinking about the United States, an advanced capitalist country, that the primary contradiction in that context, at that scale, is the contradiction between, and notice how different this is a way of thinking, or a different kind of contradiction that they're focusing on, not between classes of people, but between, as they put it, technical and economic overdevelopment combined with social and political underdevelopment. That they argued is the primary contradiction that has shaped society in the US basically from early days, founding fathers and so on and so forth. And so this brings me to the question of values. If that is the primary contradiction in the United States, our technological and economical overdevelopment combined with our social and political backwardness, basically, then you can't think about how to resolve that contradiction without addressing the question of what are our values, right? As Chaia was saying, what are our principles that are informing our work as organizations, but also just in general, our lives? How could we resolve that contradiction without facing up to our own personal and collective social and political backwardness, right? And learning together how to take responsibility, both individually and collectively, for beginning to take control of our own destiny as a country. So again, they're focused on one level analysis. We don't need to focus on the level, you don't need to think about, you don't have to ask the question, what's the primary contradiction shaping the United States? You could ask it at different levels. But once you've sorted that out, the idea is that your ideology, your revolutionary ideology, would based on projecting what would be involved in resolving that particular contradiction. And then the programs that you develop are, right, strategically oriented towards implementing that particular solution, right? So you have your revolutionary philosophy, which is dialectics, your ideology, which is the outcome, the product of applying that method at a particular scale or in a particular context, and that yields, right, strategic decisions about programs and tactics that would be used to try and implement that particular solution highlighted in your ideology. I hope that makes sense, and it's speaking to, yeah.
So we got, we're a little over, we got two last. Gonna just have them both come up, and then see any final responses from you two real quick.
Hey, peace, thank you so much. I've definitely been trying to grasp dialectics for a while. Don't totally grasp it. This has been very helpful. I wanted to share as a way of making sure I'm understanding this idea of open dialectics. The person or theorist or revolutionary who helped me understand dialectics the most concretely was Amilcar Cabral, revolutionary and agronomist from Cape Verde. And he talks about, it might have clicked for me because I'm a farmer, but he talks about the soil, and a soil as a zone of dialectics, a zone of conflict between rock or the lithos and climate, like atmos, because the body of the soil comes from the disintegration of rock, and that disintegration forms through the agency of the climate, weathering down that rock, oxidizing it, creating the parent material of soil. So in the agency of the climate is the disintegration of the rock. And so in order for the rock to subsist, it has to transform and integrate itself into a new form that is the product of that negation, which is the soil, which then is its own subsistence, but obviously creates the conditions of life subsistence. So what clicked for me with Amilcar Cabral's analysis is that these antagonistic agencies, whereas one can think of things in a way in which that means either one or the other overcomes the other side of the antagonism. Instead, we can think of it as those antagonisms create a new integrated negation existence. And I think that's very relevant for us as revolutionaries, thinking about the conditions of capitalism, of something where whatever comes next will be a manifestation of a transformation of what is in ourselves, in the material order of the world. What is will have to be the kind of substance of what becomes through that dialectics. And the soil is our kind of reference point for that, because it is, I think he's not being metaphorical, Amilcar Cabral, when he speaks of the soil as a conflict, a zone of conflict, a zone of dialectics. And if there's, I'm just trying to, is that the open dialectics kind of, is that grasping that? I just want to make sure I'm not confusing that, but also I just was offering that because this shit didn't make sense to me for a while, and then shouts out Amilcar Cabral for helping it click a bit.
Okay.
How's it going? My name's Demetrius. Really appreciate the conversation this morning. I just wanted to ask a question of clarification around the idea that contradiction is a inherent feature of life and in reality. And I wasn't sure if that was, and that there is no like inevitability. I wasn't sure if that idea of inevitability was being talked about in the context of, you know, there being an inevitable human revolution that leads to systems change, or inevitability in terms of like all of these contradictions being resolved. I wasn't sure which one it was, because it seems to me that there is an inevitability in terms of the resolution of all these contradictions, political, economic, whatever it is, and that resolution, and this might be sort of a silly point, but that resolution is climate collapse itself. The earth, not to anthropomorphize, but the earth itself is like, let me clear the palate of all the bullshit that's been going on for centuries by, you know, burning everyone to death. Not to be too dark, but that to me seems to be like that is the ultimate resolution. And I know part of that isn't inevitable. We can do different things differently. We can have different practices that mitigate the issue, but there are feedback loops. There are things there are barriers that we are breaking that we can't go back from. So I just wanted to ask that question of clarification, like in which context were you talking about inevitability? Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Do you want to ask?
I want to deal with the first conversation. What it made me think of was, without contradiction, there would be no movement at all. It would be nothing. The essence of a contradiction, what I learned to keep from building an army to kill white people, was that there was a unity of opposites, and that without contradictions, there would be no advancement in anything. But within the United States, these contradictions are antagonistic because of the lack of values, humane values, because of racism, because of individualism. We just can't sit down and have a non-antagonistic contradiction. We had to study these things in the Black Panther Party and like what you were saying, all the revolutionary movements had to study methods of thinking, philosophy, and application to understand who we're all fighting, either one way or the other. And that's all.
Chaia, did you want to respond to either of those?
Sure. I mean, the first thing I want to say is that thanks to everybody for being so patient. We're dealing with really nuanced, kind of like delicate, like I think of delicate embroidery, kind of philosophical ideas that really do take time to really kind of understand. I know for myself, I literally spent 22 consecutive summers for 4 to 6 weeks in a row, not taking one off, studying this stuff, teaching it, and learning it and studying it by teaching it. And I still teach the Institute for Social Ecology. So I just wanted to say to folks, and I don't mean to, do it self-promotion here, but my work, a lot of my political work, I'm physically disabled. So a lot of my political work is education, and I teach at the ISE. So if you're interested in this, I'm teaching a class called Philosophy and Politics of Social Ecology this October. And I really do go into, my goal is to explain why dialectical philosophy is meaningful to everyday life and to the revolutionary project. So what we've been able to do here is really offer a broad brush kind of approach. And what I wanted to add to this is really a terrible looking visual because I just made it. That Marx is looking at the contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and Boggses looking at society and nature, but Boggses is also looking at the contradiction between the hierarchy and non-hierarchy. And when we do that, not just look at the contradiction between workers and people who own the means of production, but hierarchies, all of them. That includes white supremacy, that includes racialization of all kinds, anti-Jewish racism, cis heteropatriarchy, ableism, all of it. When we do that, our principles, we sort of develop general principles that are anti-hierarchy, anti-racist, anti-cis heteropatriarchy, et cetera, that we are all accountable to when we are making policies and programs and creating movements. And in our everyday lives and how we interact with each other, we create, we are really dealing with the central contradiction between hierarchy and non-hierarchy that will always, always be there. Human beings, I think, because as a species, we're always going to be dealing with power when we're interacting with each other. And whether that's power is based on the way you're racialized or the way you conform or don't conform to a sex gender binary, we have to keep dealing with these hierarchies as they emerge. And that's central to the work of any revolutionary project. And I said the movement that's excited me the most has been the movement in Rojava, at least of late, where they literally have a co-chair system where there's not one committee, there's not a man and a woman. And that's very problematic for gender non-conforming people. But it's a start. And I've never seen that in any other revolutionary organization that adheres to that to such an intense degree. So yeah, I want to say that we're mapping out the contradictions that, really focusing on how do humans relate to each other in an interdependent, intersubjective, mutualistic, solidarity-based way, and not, and to keep trying to evade these hierarchical formations that we keep reforming and institutionalizing. So that's kind of my last 2 cents. And I invite you to email me, find me through the ISG, continue the conversation. Literally, email me through the ISG or get in contact with me. I love talking to people. And the ISG has a mentorship program where we work one-on-one with people and put people into cohorts where they can have like a kind of like a learning research kind of support group and a study and mutual aid, growing your intellectual capacity group, that we'd love to invite you into also continue the conversation.